Welcome to the North Group Podcast. We explore the ideas that shape great leadership, sharing stories, insights, and strategies to help you lead with purpose and clarity.
Well, I'm here today with friend and colleague Leron Lehman. And Leron, today we get to dive in on a conversation actually that I find really interesting and fascinating. And I think the way that we want to approach the conversation too will hopefully be helpful for everyone who's listening, but also even including ourselves. And the topic that we want to dive into is the most common mistakes that we see with succession. But also we want to explore in how do we avoid those mistakes.
Yeah.
And so let's just dive right in.
Great.
Talk to me a little bit about some of your observations of what are some of those common mistakes in succession.
Yeah, I think there's a bunch of them, things we see patterns of and regular ones. So the first thing that comes to mind for me is just simply procrastination. This is true for a lot of us in a lot of areas of our lives. It feels especially true for business owners when they're thinking about succession, planning for their future, the future of the family and the business. It's hard, it's confusing, and it's just easy to put it off or kick the can down the road. But, months turn into years really quickly, and it's almost never too early to get started. But we see a lot of times, like, I should get to that. But procrastination is just a big challenge for a lot of business owners.
Yeah. Which makes a lot of sense just because it feels like we do that in a lot of areas.
That's right.
Of like, specifically within succession, are there themes that you run into at times that you find, hey, this is often why people procrastinate on the succession idea, or maybe narratives even that people are telling themselves as to why it's not urgent?
Yeah, I follow some literature and other folks that engage in this kind of work, and sometimes you read and hear things of, it makes you think about and deal with your own mortality because we're thinking about the future. We're talking about what might happen in an emergency. We're talking about retiring or selling or moving on, and that's uncomfortable. I don't know if I fully buy that. There probably is something to it subconsciously that we want to avoid that. I just think it's much more practical in that these are things that we don't deal with every day, that I don't really understand, that I'm uncomfortable. I know people are going to ask me questions and I have to come up with answers about what do I think and what do I want, and probably involves paying somebody some fees, whether it's a consultant, whether it's an attorney, whether it's an accountant. I don't want to spend the money. So all the things we don't like are somehow in there, and so it's just easy to try to avoid it. It's uncomfortable. We don't know what to do. It's a challenge, and so we just put it off. It's a way of coping with things we don't want to deal with. So,
yeah. Which, again, both logically makes sense as well as incredibly unhelpful.
Right.
And actually, as you're talking about procrastination, it makes me think of one of the things often in family businesses in particular that I find, and it's related actually with procrastination, but I'm curious your take on this too, is the idea that procrastination or not believing that this is all that urgent or something I should be doing today leads to a real lack of communication and either not knowing what to talk about or, well, what do I tell people? I'm 40 years old, and yes, this is a family business, but why would I be talking to my kids who are 20 about it? Maybe what's underneath why we don't communicate in succession, or maybe don't communicate well around there?
I think it's hard to talk about this with a lot of clarity without digging into family systems and the patterns that we've developed, the culture that we have in our family, how we relate to each other, how we resolve conflict, and ultimately how we communicate. And it's not that we're all deeply unhealthy about those things, but all of us could be more healthy in those things. And when it comes to just daily life and talking about sports and what's going on and spending time with the grandkids or your own children, it's easy to have a lot of conversations and feel great and get good about it. But I think we all know from experience, and certainly there's research to support this, when it comes to important matters about our desires for the future or financial matters, issues of values, for some reason, these don't just come up in conversation. And so we don't have a pattern, and often there's not the tools that are built into how we handle things, that it just doesn't come natural.
Yeah.
And when we have these patterns that have developed over years, sometimes even over generations, you can't just flip the switch like, all right, I'm 60, I guess I should start talking about it. Maybe we should initiate a conversation.
Yeah.
So it's outside of our normal behavior, and it takes some real effort and intentionality to get to the place where you can start the conversation. And then it becomes easier. But there's a lot of inertia to overcome to really get the ball rolling on these things.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, on that topic of both procrastination, but even maybe that it leading to a lack of communication or not viewing it as really important, what either serves as a catalyst or what's a tipping point that moves people toward action that either we see, and maybe it's an illustration or example, but where it feels like what often tips the scale that actually gets people to do something about it? Is it age? Is it some sort of crisis? Is it...
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, there's a few things that I've just come across fairly recently. One would be a health scare. Something happened to me or somebody close to me, and it just reminded me and made me take these things a little bit more seriously. Another one, a client that we're working with right now, two brothers are running this business, and they had a general manager who announced he was going to retire, and he was a little bit younger than them.
Wow.
And that was a real catalyst to think about, wow, he's younger than us and he's thinking about retiring. We haven't made plans for our own exit from this business and how we're going to get out of this and what it might look like in the future. So that was a real catalyst for them. I think, we're in the unique position that we deal with a lot of family businesses and a lot of clients. And so we're able to nudge clients sometimes, and sometimes more than a nudge, but sometimes a third party or an outsider to remind or say, hey, we should engage in some conversations about that. Sometimes that's enough of a catalyst to get some folks talking about it. So what do you see? Have you seen any similar type scenarios or other things that have become common?
Yeah, well, even as you were giving some of those illustrations, it takes me back a few years to a conversation I had with a gentleman who was rapidly approaching 70. And we were just casually talking. He happened to mention that he had a family business and was thinking about transitioning it. And just out of curiosity, I asked him if he had an idea of timeline in mind. And now rapidly approaching 70 years old. And he had just thrown out sometime in the next maybe 3 to 5 years. And the way that he said it certainly alluded that he thought that was far off. And as I walked away from the conversation, the thing that was in the back of my mind was, how is it that, not just for him, but even for myself, that I view time more accurately, where 3 to 5 years for him is going to be here unbelievably quickly.
Right.
And with no conversations having started, it just felt like, okay, what is a practical first step?
Right.
Is the question I was asking myself that would make me as a business owner take some action. Like, what would that action be? How would I, engage some third party? If I had family members that were in the business, do I just call a meeting and tell them, hey, I'd like to start some conversation about the future.
Right.
But it also made me wonder, what fears do we either not realize are underneath some of our procrastination, and or just assumptions that we're telling ourselves. And back to something that you mentioned earlier, this idea of not really dealing with our own mortality, or imagining that if things are going swimmingly, why wouldn't that continue?
Right.
But never really taking into account the idea that, hey, that might not be true tomorrow.
Right.
Or on the way into work tomorrow, I could slip on ice and break my hip and not be able to come in and run things. And so it had this question in the back of my mind of, even for myself, what are underlying fears or underlying assumptions that I'm making that actually lead to me mistakenly thinking about succession as a far off thing.
And I think a lot of we hear these stories all the time of business owners who have taken the business over from their father, their uncle, somebody else in their family. And it wasn't handled in a methodical or intentional way. One story comes to mind where a business owner who's now retiring, planning some of his own succession, said, yeah, when I took over, my uncle came in and threw the keys on the desk and said, it's yours now.
Wow. Wow.
And so we have these models of, well, my dad didn't prepare me. Mm-hmm. My uncle didn't prepare me. Well, and so it just sort of seems natural that, well, I'm sure it'll work out.
Yeah.
Probably be fine.
Yeah. Yeah.
And this 3 to 5 year thing has been 3 to 5 years for the last decade.
That's exactly
right. It's always 3 or 5 years from now.
Exactly.
So it's just easy to fall into these patterns and everything's fine. We'll get to it.
Right.
And then we don't get to it. So,
yeah. I think one of the things I often find as well, and maybe related with some of these stories, is we ourselves have not yet prepared ourselves as business owners emotionally.
Right.
And that maybe sounds like a weird way to couch it, but what I mean by that is that we've not necessarily thought about what will life be like after I sell this business or after I transition this to the next generation. In what ways am I preparing myself for life after that?
Yeah.
And is also just even to recognize that it will be an emotional process. Even if I don't think of myself as an emotional person, there's probably more wrapped up in the business, even from an identity standpoint, than what I might understand.
Right.
And so how do I actually prepare myself or take steps to begin to prepare myself for some level of emotional preparedness of life after the business?
It's one of the, maybe that's the one we should have started with. You could argue that it's one of the more significant, perhaps the most significant in terms of readiness and challenges when it comes to succession. But often it's something that sneaks up late in the game or maybe even after the fact. Because I think, when I think about our customer base, we got great clients. And these are well-adjusted, healthy, mature, self-aware people. Mm-hmm. And we would all acknowledge at some level that, of course, my identity is tied to my work. I like being associated with this. I like when I go out, people recognize the position that I hold. Yes. And so at some level, there's some basic awareness. But everybody also thinks that, but I'm looking forward to a change. And I think it's surprising to them when that change comes and they feel lost. Yeah. And then it becomes much more apparent. So I think it's just a really tough one. There are plenty of great books and resources to read. There's other people that have gone before you can speak with. There's folks like us or other trusted advisors. But really just spending time contemplating, thinking about it, and having some things to replace that void. Yeah. It's probably not golf 40 hours a week. Yeah. It probably is some hobbies. It's probably relationships. Maybe it's travel. Yeah. But it's something else that gives you meaning and purpose. And all of this is cliche. Like, we all know this, and yet it still comes as a huge surprise to people when they find themselves in that position. Yeah. A statistic I refer to a lot, there's some research fairly recently that has pointed out 75% of business owners that have exited their business regret doing so within 1 year. Wow. And this is the reason. Wow. It's an emotional state, an identity kind of thing, a lack of purpose. Yeah. And I think it's natural and to be expected that there will be some challenges, but 75% actually regret it. That seems like a tragedy to me. And I think that can be wholly avoided. Yeah. Because there are steps you can take to prepare yourself, include your spouse, talk about things, build some hobbies, find some other purpose and interests that you can really devote yourself to. It's super important and often neglected.
Interesting. Interesting. Yeah. Have you witnessed, and I'm thinking about this even as I'm asking the question, even from my own experience, have you witnessed somebody that has transitioned in a really healthy way where they wouldn't have been in that 75%, but maybe the 25% of feeling like, hey, that went well? And if so, what were some of the things that you saw as steps that they took in preparing themselves?
Right. Yeah, one comes to mind in particular, and he retired going on 2 years ago. I just saw him, ran into him at breakfast about a month or two ago. And, he's always been a happy-go-lucky kind of guy. But, had some really important work that he did, a couple of sort of different career paths. And I said, so how is it in retirement? And he wasn't putting me on. You could tell it was totally legitimate and genuine. I said, it's just great.
That's awesome.
And my sense with him is he was, he's a very spiritual, strong man of strong faith, heavily involved in his church, deep and close ties with his family, and has a clear sense of his identity beyond what he has always done.
Interesting.
And it just felt like he went into it with intention, and it has worked out great for him. It's weird that would be the exception, but I think that's the goal. That's what we all want, whether we're selling a business or transitioning to the next generation or just simply retiring.
Yeah.
That's what we all want.
Yeah.
And I think it's achievable, but I'm not sure it just happens without some work.
Yeah. Yeah. No, I would certainly agree.
Yeah.
As you were giving that illustration, I think the one that it makes me think of is probably going on 4 years ago now. Gentleman transitioned, and he would have been in his late 50s, actually, as he retired from the business, transitioned it to the next generation. And in doing so, even as I'm thinking about it now, one of the things that struck me as so interesting in first getting to know him is that he had started, this was a family business going into the third generation, and he had started conversation with that next generation when he was in his early 40s. And so by the time it was in his late 50s, this was something that they were talking about frequently.
Right.
Yes, in greater detail as more details became available or as he better understood the timeline that he wanted to be on. But when he first started talking about it, he didn't have an idea of when he wanted to retire.
Right.
And it was more the proactive communication, back to what we were talking about earlier, that made the conversation permissible for the next generation to ask questions of him. Well, Dad, what are you thinking about, when you imagine what retirement might look like? Well, I don't know, was a fine answer. Like, I'm still thinking that through. Your mother and I are talking about that. But I think sometimes that actually stands as a barrier, that we think we have to have an answer to those questions before we open the conversation, which stands as a big barrier. And I'd probably call it a mistake in even making the conversation permissible. Well, I don't really want to talk about retirement. And if I'm in my early 40s and I want to work till I'm in my mid 60s, why would I even talk about it? But the idea a lot of times is just to make the conversation permissible for the next generation, or if it's not a family business, for other key leaders to think about, hey, someday Leron's not going to be here. And is it okay to talk about that day, even though we don't know when that day is?
So the three themes that have emerged so far in our conversation: procrastination, not being prepared emotionally, and this idea of communication. And obviously we deal a lot with family businesses, and succession has a special role there because there's generational issues and family matters to attend to. But it's just as important in a non-family business, and there's some parallels there. When we think about communication, are there some other specific things you've seen or best practices, or even some things that maybe we at North Group would recommend to family or non-family businesses when we're thinking about what are the things we should be communicating about? How do we go about that? Anything you've seen or recommend?
I think the first word that comes to mind maybe sounds like a strange one, but is putting some structure to the conversations. Ad hoc conversations about them are certainly not a bad thing, but I think where I've seen it go really well, people decided to take an intentional approach and put some structure to talking about succession. And so I'll give one example where when we first engaged with them, they were already talking about succession. It was a family business. And they had 2 meetings per year that they would gather the whole family together. And the only topic was updates on succession. And again, these folks were in their 50s, so maybe had a 10-year time horizon approximately in front of them. And sometimes they had things to share. Sometimes it was just getting together and going through the discipline of talking about succession. And so the idea of having some structure and intentionality to communicating I think often moves us away from procrastination too, because in some ways we're accountable to show up at that meeting with some update.
Yeah.
Be that something that I feel is significant or not.
Yep.
At least the structure is there to help me. So I don't feel like, hey, how do I know when I have enough information that it warrants calling a family meeting?
Right.
Well, that's so subjective that maybe I never feel like I get there, or I keep feeling like, well, I need to close that loop or check that box yet, then I'll call the family meeting.
Right.
But back to the idea of that 3 to 5 year timeline was 3 to 5 years, 10 years ago, you know, and we kind of never get around to it. So structure, I think, would be one. In your interaction with folks, are there things that...
Yeah, I think structure, that's a really good one. It just starts to build some muscles and creates a scaffolding on which to build some things. I think just engaging in a conversation. So one way that I would think about it in a family business is often just starting to draft some family policies around what does employment look like? How do we create pathways and start a conversation with the next generation? And it might not even be about succession or leadership or ownership. It might just be about, where does the business sit in our family? Do you have an interest in being involved? Here's what we think it might look like if you do. Be invitational about that, not with an expectation of anything, but open a dialogue about it. And then that sort of naturally leads to some of these other discussions of, where am I going here? Is this a career? Is this a job? Like, what's the future look like? What's your timeline, Dad? What are we thinking here?
Yeah.
And I think that starting down that path and developing some policies and some clarity and some expectations, it just naturally then leads into succession planning when the time comes.
Yeah. Which makes a lot of sense. Is there's kind of that natural progression that would lead to the conversation along the way. Yeah.
So in addition to those three, which for me are some of the more significant ones around procrastinating, communicating well, and preparing emotionally, a few other things come to my mind. Anything else come to your mind as kind of challenges, or be careful to avoid this when it comes to succession planning?
Yeah, I think one of the mistakes that even as we've been having our conversation is occurring to me too, as somewhat of a theme as I think back on where it's gone well and where it's not gone so well, is a lot of times, and it probably falls into the communication category, but when there are family tensions or just relational tensions, if it's a non-family business, often I've seen a total avoidance of conversations about the future, be that succession related or just be that about creating some level of expectation of what might be to come. And so I think I'd name that one really to kind of put it on the table, even as a check to myself, that I think that often when there's relational tensions, the greatest place that we move towards is avoidance.
Yeah.
And that is so unhelpful, in particular when we think about succession, because it's going to lead to procrastination. It's going to lead to that avoidance of communication. And that ends up creating dysfunction, because I think the other thing kind of sitting inside of some of what we've been talking about is that if we're not communicating about the future, or if there's a tension that we never name and figure out how to work through, often what creeps in is a whole lot of assumption.
Right.
And those assumptions often have a complete lack of either reality or truth to them. But it's back to the old saying that whatever I think is true for me.
Right.
And so my reality is what I'm thinking about. And anywhere that there's a blank or a lack of communication, I'm filling that in with some assumption. And typically that is a wrong assumption or has some degree of fallacy to it.
Right.
And so I think that would be one, is that if there's tension somewhere, it is worth figuring that out and addressing it.
Yeah.
Because the big mistake of avoidance is that there's also going to be a whole lot of dysfunction that comes along with it, often stemming from a bunch of assumptions because we're not talking.
Right. Yeah, it's a great point. I was thinking of something very similar, and I would think of it as we tend to move towards the transactional, the facts, the technical, at the expense of some of the relational at times. And I think it's particularly true maybe for business people, because we're very action-oriented. But there's a lot of behavioral styles that are more task-focused than people-focused, and that tends to be discount some of the relational matters and let's focus on, well, what do we have to do? How do we think about valuation? How do we think about structure? What's our timeline? Maybe we should have our attorney draft some. How much taxes is this going to cost us anyway? And if we do all that without the relational, we're missing a huge piece of it.
Yeah.
I also think it's particularly prevalent. Maybe it's a little bit of a Lancaster County thing. And even from the backgrounds and the family cultures and the faith cultures that we and many of our clients come from, we're not that comfortable with the emotional relational things. And it makes it a barrier in our family cultures and in our culture at large to really bring these things up and deal with them because it's uncomfortable. And can't we just move on here?
Yeah.
And in reality, we can't. No, because this is a barrier that we have to figure out how to deal with.
Yeah.
So I think it's part of the communication factor, but the relational aspect of this is really big, especially in family businesses.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And the idea of relational, be that tension or just be that even failing to deal with relational dynamics inside of a family business or non-family business, are there tactics, are there practices that you have seen as a maybe simple way of getting started? Like if we've got relational issues inside of our family business, what's a first step? Or what's a practical step that actually would help us get to that? Because to your point, often our backgrounds have not equipped us with dealing with these challenges, maybe at all, or certainly not necessarily in a healthy way.
Yeah.
And so when we go to address it, sometimes we inflame things and therefore we avoid them.
Right.
And so are there practical things that would come to mind for you or things that you've seen that would just be, this would help to bring kind of some fresh air in the room as a first step?
Yeah, well, I think the obvious one is to get a third party involved to facilitate some conversations. Obviously, that's what we do at North Group. And part of the reason we have a business is because there's a significant need for these kinds of things. And we approach almost all the work we do, certainly when it comes to succession planning, with a relational mindset of, are we aligned? Are our values shared? What are the principles we're trying to uphold? What are we optimizing for? And often that comes down to relational issues, a lot of discussions. And we live it every day. These are hard conversations to have. And so having somebody that can ask questions, that can facilitate, really helps. It doesn't have to be North Group, of course. It can be another trusted advisor. Sometimes there's another family member or sort of an elder statesman in the family, so that maybe has some history and there's some real shared trust. I don't think it's necessarily imperative that you have somebody else to facilitate the conversations, but if you're struggling to have them, it probably means that you could use some help. And so that would be the first thing that comes to my mind is, find somebody to help you talk about the things. And it provides some accountability along the way. And if you set up a meeting and someone else is coming, you're probably going to go. It's harder to cancel if there's somebody else showing up that's expecting to participate. So I don't know, any other ideas you have around that?
I think that's a great one. And the idea of inviting somebody else into the conversation, I think also provides the opportunity to begin to work through it. But often I think too, the benefit of involving somebody else, an older statesman, a family counselor, a person from North Group, wherever it might be, is also the opportunity to, as an individual, for me to begin to work through, how am I a part of this? Because way too frequently, it's easy to look at the other person, and that's the issue, right? But to bring some level of accountability, not just to the process, but even to us as individuals, I think is such a healthy thing. Back to the idea of even emotionally preparing for whatever transition might look like or succession might look like long term. And I'm even speaking personally, often it's too easy for me to discount the work that I should be doing personally. And how am I involved in whatever this relational tension is, be that directly or indirectly. The fact that I've never addressed it, the fact that I've avoided it is just as harmful as the fact of being a direct contributor, to it. And so to your point, I think that involving another person has so many benefits, including the work for us personally to be doing as we work through succession.
Yeah. Often we've been complicit in this thing that we say is somebody else's problem.
That's right. That's exactly right. Yeah.
There's a couple other ones I'll highlight. These are less relational, but still really important and can really throw a wrench in things if you're not aware of these or you don't think about them or plan appropriately. And they're slightly more technical, but still not always fun to deal with, and therefore things we might put off. And they're sort of related in that they relate to economic and technical matters. So one would be just valuation of the business, and closely related would be my own. If I'm a outgoing or a senior founder, family member, business owner, and I'm starting to think about succession, what's my personal financial situation? Am I ready personally? And does the value in the business support my plans? This would be true any sort of exit you're thinking about, selling your company, passing it to the next generation, maybe some other internal transition or management buyout. And, many business owners have planned appropriately, have other assets outside the business, and they feel like, I'd like to get something out of this as I make the transition, but I don't really need anything to live comfortably. And that's a really great spot to be in. But not everybody's in that situation. And sometimes there's an unrealistic view of what this thing is worth, or maybe what can the business support to pay me out over time, and thinking, well, I need this much money, and yet that's not reality, and then we've kind of got a problem. And so, spending some time with a financial advisor. Some people can run the numbers themselves, but it's always good. Like, these are consequential type things. It's good to get somebody that has some modeling, that understands this stuff, can help you work through it. Am I personally ready from a financial standpoint? And do I understand the value of my business, and does it support the objectives that we're working towards? Those are sometimes uncomfortable and frankly sometimes surprising to business owners. So I think we would always advise that there's some real value in tackling those things fairly early in the process. Once you get to the 11th hour, it's hard to make changes. But while you still have time, good to get your arms around those things.
Yeah, well, and I love the fact that you're pointing out to the idea of like starting early. So using the example of even asking myself the question, am I financially prepared, and or is the business at some position where it can support whatever I might need for, be that retirement or be that for the transition itself, et cetera. Would you have in mind some timeline? Like, what practically might that look like, or what should I be thinking about as a business owner of what might starting early mean? And maybe it's not an exact timeline, but if I'm 50 years old and I'm thinking of working in the business another 10 years or 15 years, is it too early for me to start in that? Are there elements I could start in?
Yeah, I think it's never too early to do some things. So, for example, understanding what your business is worth and what are the things that drive that value and what part do I play in that is something that any business owner at any stage of life should understand. So, for example, some of the biggest barriers to transitioning a business are an unrealistic view of value, or it's too dependent on the owner. It's not transferable. And that's true whether you're 25 or you're 55. And so understanding that and knowing what drives value and having a handle on value is always appropriate, even if you're not moving towards succession. So I think that's really important. I just feel like it's prudent to be financially aware of, where am I? Do I have the right insurance or liquidity? Am I on track for retirement? What am I building here? Now, if you're 25, it's probably not quite as critical, but that's the age at which we're building habits and putting ourselves on a trajectory. So even early on, some of these basic things are just prudent ways to run your life and run your business. When it comes to some of the other things, perhaps it's premature at that age to really start trying to identify your successor. But as the children get older, there's conversations to have. We talked about building some structure or some family policies. Certainly once you hit your 50s, I feel like it's time to start figuring it out. Even if you want to work till you're 65 or 70, it's time to have plans in place. It's time to be talking about that with people and be ready to go with things. And so, it's different depending on different situations. None of this is written in stone. But I would say there's always something to be done, and it's never too early to at least be thinking about and preparing for things like this.
Yeah. No, that's really helpful. All right. So we've covered a whole number of things that are kind of common mistakes that we see in succession. Everything from procrastination to the idea of lack of communication, maybe emotionally unprepared as we get ready, maybe financially unprepared, or just not aware of where I should be at. If I'm a business owner, I've not yet done something around succession, what would be an encouragement as a place to get started? What would be something that I could do, maybe even this week, that would begin to put me on a path toward being able to do succession in a healthy way, to avoid a lot of these mistakes, if you will?
This is probably very unique to each individual. I'll tell you something that works for me when I think about something I'm procrastinating or something I know I need to do. And so this would be my answer. And I would hope all of our listeners or viewers would say, I can do that.
Yeah.
For me, it's pretty simple. Send somebody a text. We should talk about this. And once you send the text, send the email, make the phone call, it's out there and you can kind of no longer ignore it. Sometimes that's, I send a text to my wife, like, I've been avoiding this thing, like, we're having dinner tomorrow night, like, let's talk about this.
Yeah.
And that could be a business partner, it could be a spouse, it could be a child, could be a trusted advisor, could be one of us at North Group.
Yeah.
Just a simple, like, hey, I've been thinking about this, can we talk about this next time we're together?
Yeah.
And then it just sort of, it just somehow makes it easier. You don't have to work it into a conversation. It doesn't feel so awkward.
Yep.
So that'd be my advice. Send a text.
Yep.
Yeah.
I love that. And it applies to all of us, no matter where we're at on the journey.
Right.
Be that haven't started yet, just starting, or maybe we're advanced down the path, but we know that there's something else that we've not yet done or have been avoiding along the way.
Right.
So, well, Leron, thank you.
This is great.
It's been, a fun conversation, but also I think insightful, even personally, on, hey, what are the things that are the common mistakes? How is it that we avoid them as we're on this succession journey? So thank you.
There's so many of these things, and we only touched on a few of the more significant ones. But in reality, the response to all of these is, just get started. Send the text, start having the conversations. The path tends to reveal itself as you go, and it's not nearly as scary or troubling or difficult as it first seems. Just take the first step, and things sort of tend to work out.
Yeah,
so
I think that's great, and also doing away with the idea that we have to have the answers before stepping on the path.
Right.
In fact, getting on the path is just the acknowledgement that we don't have the answers.
Yes.
And that's moving us toward truth. It's moving us toward discovery of what should I be doing as we're on this journey.
Right.